All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll keep an eye on the waiting room and let other folks in as they join us. But thank you so much for joining this program this evening. This is the Violentization of Circe with Walsh University professor Dr. Bob Humphries. My name is Stephanie Toole. I'm the Education Outreach Manager at the Massillon Museum. This program is a part of the NEA Big Read, and it is the 14th consecutive NEA Big Read in Massillon and Western Stark County. You can learn more about programs at massillonmuseum.org/Big Read. Programming will continue through May 2nd. NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. During this program today, Dr. Humphries will be sharing some slides with us, and you can all leave your video and audio off. If you have any questions throughout the program, feel free to put those through the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And then we will have time for Q&A at the end of the program. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Humphries. Dr. Bob Humphries has been part of the Walsh University family for 40 years. First, as a student, he earned both a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a master's degree in counseling. He served as a trustee to the Walsh Alumni Association from 1989 through 1996. Upon completing his master's, he went to work for Child and Adolescent Service Center as a child therapist until 1986, when he resumed his doctoral work on a full-time basis. Prior to finishing his doctorate in counseling psychology from the University of Akron, Bob completed a predoctoral internship through Northeastern Ohio College of Medicine Psychology Internship Program. He returned to Walsh as an adjunct professor in 1989 until his full-time appointment in 1999. He retired as an associate professor of psychology in the summer of 2020. Bob also does clinical work privately at Vista Psychological and Counseling Center, LLC. His practice has included work with children, adolescents, families, and adults. He holds a license as a psychologist, continues membership in the American Psychological Association, Ohio Psychological Association, as well as the American Counseling Association and the American Mental Health Counselor Association. Bob has served on local community service boards and has consulted with a number of local agencies. Bob is married to another Walsh alumni, Judy, and has 2 children, Nicholas and Jenna. In addition to his election by the senior class of 2002 as Outstanding Educator of the Year, he was named Walsh University's Outstanding Alumni in the fall of 2002 for his many contributions to Walsh and the greater community. He was named in the Ohio Magazine 2006 Excellence in Education Award, and he received an Outstanding Teaching Award from the faculty for the 2007 to 2008 academic year. Most recently, he was named About Magazine's Top Doc Psychologist in October 2015. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Humphries.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try to get my camera back on and start the video for you. Good evening, everybody. Dr. Humphries, I want to talk a little bit today about Circe. And we know that some people have considered the character, the archetype for the predatory female. From a psychological standpoint, even though this is a piece of literature, it's a historical piece of literature in the fact that it goes back to Greek mythology, although this is a much more contemporary swing on it. And it kind of begs the question that we look at in psychology about the question of nature and nurture. There would be those that might contend that the nature of being somebody born to the gods, as it were, but not really feeling accepted because of the split in her status, that this may have been a part of what made her character so inherently evil. But if we look at this from the side of violentization, we should be able to see that there may have been some things that were more cultivating about that. So let me share some things with you, if I could, about violentization, and give you just kind of a picture of these kinds of things. when we talk about violentization, it is this process where we are kind of indoctrinated into being more violent. And we see this happening through about 4 developmental sequences with 4 distinctive elements. Each of these elements plays a different role, and we will talk about these in the sequence that they occur, so that we can appreciate the journey that Circe takes to become a person who takes this kind of violent path. These 4 elements include brutalization, personal horrification, belligerence, and then this last term here known as virulency. Now, brutalization is going to involve several things. It is exposure to distinct but overlapping encounters with violent subjugation, personal horrification, and violent coaching. In essence, what happens in this brutalization portion of this violentization process, the individual will encounter repeated instances of extreme violence, both as a victim and as an observer. Now, we certainly have a number of things that Circe was exposed to in the course of her development, that she was subject to this brutalization. I don't want to take credit for all of these, as Haley was kind enough to assist me with this process. But we know that Circe was bullied by a brother and sister in childhood. Now, again, here we see this victimization taking place. And of course, you can't escape siblings. And so there was this repetitious and this inability to escape that was very much a part of that. Circe's father burns her after she is disrespectful. And when we look at that kind of behavior, again, most people do not expose themselves to that kind of violence. Most people are not deliberately burned for an act of disrespect. And so, again, this becomes a part of this brutalization process. Again, when we think about this, that could be seen from the perspective of violent subjugation. You will submit, obviously, to her father's will and be respectful of him. There's a violent subjugation component to that. And again, it's obviously when we think about the relationship that is supposed to take place in more normal kinds of situations between a father and a daughter, between a parent and a child, this is a relationship that is supposed to be about trust and learning to trust one another. And so not only is it violent subjugation, but there is a certain degree of personal horrification that comes along with the violation of trust that is supposed to be a part of the parent-child relationship. And again, it makes 4 changes in this process and these steps toward violentization. Another example that comes to mind is Circe's sexual assault and rape and attack by men who land on the island that she is exiled on. And when we look at this, or we have some understanding of this, again, this would be considered to be an extreme instance of violence. In the clinical sense of this, we know that people will experience experience this level of violence, and that this level of trauma oftentimes will experience a separate set of symptoms that we refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder, where there is a reliving of the experience, intrusive thoughts that will accompany this. And if they are able to avoid those intrusive thoughts in those moments of reliving the trauma during the waking hours, that oftentimes they come back to the person in the sleeping time hours through their dreams. And so there is this sense almost of inescape from that kind of a trauma. And again, the essence of that becomes a part of this brutalization process that we look at as being a part of what happens with Circe. So again, when we look at brutalization, a child that may be repeatedly experiencing physical, sexual abuse, and or witness its infliction on on a mom or a sibling, the chronic infliction of pain and suffering may bring the individual to respond in an aggressive way, but an effective way to retaliate toward the aggressor. If we think about the fact that when Circe's father burned her for the act of disrespect, the disrespect may have been a part of that retaliation process, a way of retaliating against the aggressor that wasn't effective and wasn't working and didn't serve the purpose to stop what was happening. And I think there's a sense of helplessness that comes from that. And it becomes a further part of the brutalization process. As such, the victim's physical and emotional suffering eventually leads to the acceptance of the aggressor's dominance and control. And so, again, there is almost a sense of giving up that occurs as part of the brutalization process. And, you know, again, I think at least in terms of Circe, it brings to mind the question about whether or not, having been inflicted with that kind of dominance and control, whether she wants to be a part of the world of the gods. And that becomes one of the internal struggles that she wrestles with, I think. Integral to that control is personal horrification. It's whereby the victim helplessly witnesses the infliction of pain and suffering on another. They're unable to defend themselves or a cherished other person, and the victim experiences a mix of intense rage, personal humiliation, and self-loathing. We know that for Circe, she watches Prometheus get punished. Again, feeling helpless as she witnesses the infliction of pain and suffering. She watches and hears about sailors getting eaten by Scylla on the way on her way to visit her sister. And again, feeling helpless to do anything about that. And of course, Circe watching her son get taken away by Athena. Again, unable to defend this cherished son. Again, there's going to be a great deal of rage, that great sense of personal humiliation, and a great sense of self-loathing. Those things become a part of how she moves ever closer to becoming the perpetrator of violence. And again, earning very much that notion of being the archetype of what we see as the predatory woman. I think that piece is something that we look at and that we can appreciate because, again, we have these horrible things that are happening, and the effect overall is to help facilitate the development of this very violent outlook. The effective melange motivates the victim's acquisition of the skills and attitudes necessary in acts of violence and brutality. Now, if we think about this for a moment, certainly we know that Circe was not, she didn't have the magical, or she didn't have the powers of the gods, but instead had magic that she was able to use. And she uses that magic in violent kinds of ways and brutalizing kinds of ways as she is treating others from the framework of her own experiences with personal horrification. So what we see is this journey where we're acquiring all these skills. So not only are we horrifically exposed to these things, but there's also a learning that takes place along the way, where we're not only getting the skills to be hurtful to others, but this attitude and this outlook. We see the world and come to view the world through an attitude and a filter where it's not a safe place. It's a kill or be killed kind of perspective or outlook that taints all that we do and all the things that become a part of who we are in acting out in our own violent kinds of ways, if those things make sense. If that makes sense to you. You know, exploiting the underlying rage, the aggressor as a model and coach nurtures the victim's capacity to strike out at others and respond forcefully to provocation from anyone other than the aggressor. And again, here we don't have to put up with anything from anybody else, but you're going to have to tolerate it from me. And again, this I think connects well if we look at the relationship. If we look at the relationship of Circe to those who seem to have power over her, and we can see those kinds of things as a part of this personal horrification experience. Again, we want to make sure that we have some understanding and appreciation of that. When we comes to belligerence, we begin this part of the sequence because it begins to raise within the victim doubts about the very essence of human trust and affiliation. And can we trust others? Can we connect to others? Okay. And whether or not that is something that we are able to do. And particularly when we are talking about the violation of trust in the parent-child relationship, I think in outside of the novel realm, but inside of what we look at in terms of human beings, we learn our trust very much from our parents. And they can give us this sense of whether or not to be open to trusting other people. And when we're talking about this coming about in terms of violentization, this belligerent piece is going to be able to disrupt any kind of sense of trust, any way to connect to others. Erickson, who is another psychology theorist, might talk about this in terms of one of the very first kind of psychosocial developmental steps in terms of the personality development. And he talks about trust versus mistrust that occurs in infancy between the child and the parent. And kind of looks at that and says that, again, a person may learn to mistrust the world because they're not able to be taken care of properly by that parent very early on. And so here we're seeing this kind of taken a little bit of a stronger stance because, again, in belligerence, again, we doubt we can trust anybody. We doubt that we are going to be able to connect and affiliate with anyone. When we adopt this belligerent attitude of reflexive aggression, it provides the victim some opportunities for self-esteem as well as self-protection. Okay, think about this. If the world is this terrible place, I'm going to have to shield against anything happening to me. And the only way that I'm going to feel good about myself is if I'm safe behind the shield. I need protection because I have been victimized. I have been taught that the world is a horrible place and that I'm not able to take care of things. When we see, in Circe's case, we see that she begins turning all of the sailors who visit the island into pigs to protect herself. This is a part of that reflexive aggression. This is part of that belligerent outlook. And if we look at this and kind of appreciate the subtleties of what it says, she seems very satisfied with herself for having been able to use this magic in order to do this and is able to feel safe in the process. Circe obtains the most poisonous substances on earth in order to protect herself from Athena. And again, the one way I can feel safe is to be able to adopt this reflexive aggression. Okay. And in this case, she takes what she knows in terms of the magic and uses these poisonous substances as a means of self-protection. And self-protection becomes very much a part of what we see with respect to belligerence. Let me take this a step further. We see a forceful, unyielding stance that offers the potential controlling future situations and thereby avoiding further victimization. And this attitude can remain emotional rather than behavioral until the individual actually performs the violent act. And so this could be an outlook to begin with and eventually move toward some action. And if we look at this in terms of Circe, we can certainly go back and just looking at the act of threatening her father, something that had earned her his wrath in the past, but threatening her father in order to break her exile is a part of moving from an attitude and an outlook, this emotional side of belligerence, in order to perform this violent act of making these threats to him as a part of her belligerence and as a part of her incorporation and indoctrination in the violentization process. Athens would argue that the outcome of forays into violence determines their subsequent frequency and intensity. And so when we look at belligerence, how often do we see this manifest? And again, we know that throughout her experiences, Circe, time and again, comes to with great frequency and intensity, begins to act, and certainly has this emotional belligerence in what she does. I think the novel offers some sense of humanity to her that perhaps the original Greek mythology did not. I think they just kind of depict her in this evil way. But it also allows us to connect this sense of this sequential process that takes place in the violentization process that allows us to see that, you know, she went through this formative process to be able to get to this kind of behavior. And it certainly wasn't, you can almost begin to have some degree of sympathy because of all that she's been through. The final ingredient in the violentization process is the acquisition of virulency. And that is the capacity, to control situations largely out of the recognition of one's capacity to inflict harm, pain, and serious injury or death. And we know that for Circe, the virulency is definitely seen because the visitors to the island, the people that come to the island, all of the sailors, whether they have been the ones who've attacked her or who don't attack her, now become people that she inflicts pain and harm to. She turns them all into pigs. And so we can see that this is a part of that virulent process for her. At this point, the individual is recognized as a dangerously violent person, willing to engage in any act, however brutal, to gain a desired end, be it for gratification or subjugation of a victim. And so we look at this and see, again, when we look at Circe as some people regard her as the archetype of the predatory female. Again, look at the language here: gratification and subjugation of a victim. Okay, and in that role as that archetype of this female predator, we can begin to see that this virulency is really manifest itself for her. You know, we can see this virulency in some of the acts that take place while on the island. For example, she she takes no measure to hide her lions, so that visitors that come will be frightened and afraid of them and scare those that come. Again, this is part of that virulent kind of outlook. In combination, these elements produce an individual willing to do anything to avoid a return to the earlier experiences of being brutalized, horrified, humiliated, and especially subjugated. And certainly that becomes a part of her demands at being released, and having her father break her exile. These elements are saying, I'm not going to be punished anymore. I'm done. Release me. And that becomes very much a part of this sense of virulency. Okay. I would love to be open to any kinds of questions or comments or thoughts about this that I might be able to answer and talk about. I hope I kind of gave you a sense of how violence and is can be a nurtured process, and how when we are reading about Circe, we find that these things have been a part of what's happened with her. So Stephanie, I'm not sure how you, if Haley is moderating questions or if you're doing that, but I'm open to those kinds of things.
So just put a message in the chat. If anyone has access to the chat but doesn't have access to audio, feel free to put questions in the chat as well. And in the meantime, I do have a question.
Okay.
I was wondering, so you talked a lot about the archetype of the predatory woman. Would you be able to talk a little more about that, what that consists of, and like the origin of the archetype of the predatory woman?
Now, again, when we talk about archetypal language, oftentimes the reference is to Carl Jung. And Carl Jung would have suggested to us that there are, that the personality formation goes back to incorporating these various archetypes from what he termed the collective unconscious. And it's almost kind of philosophical, and it's in the way that he talks about this. But Jung was a neo-Freudian, but he talked about, instead of our personalities becoming what they become in the first 5 years of life, he was suggesting to us that there is this self archetype, of who we are, and that we are incorporating all of these other kinds of archetypes from the collective unconscious into those, and that these archetypes are going to be reflected in things like our literature and our art, and they're going to resonate with people. I don't want to get too far astray because this might take us to a different place, but the archetype, if you think about in contemporary kind of media for just a moment, Star Wars was something that started off in 1977, and we are still talking about it in 2021. And one of the things that they did was the genre of the sci-fi adventure kind of thing was considered to be dead at that point in time. And 20th Century Fox, and George Lucas, they took this risk. And one of the things they did was consult a Jungian psychologist, and they wanted something that was going to resonate with people. And so we have this coming of age of some youthful person by the name of Luke Skywalker. We have the good and the evil of the Force and the dark side of the Force, which in Jungian terms would be the shadow archetype. We have we start looking at those kinds of themes. The father archetype is seen in Obi-Wan Kenobi, just as an example. So when we talk about this archetype, usually when we're referencing archetypes, we're talking about archetypes going back to Jung. And I didn't think to, I'm not sure if it goes specifically back to Jung or not. I can't answer that question. But what I would dare say, because I didn't do the research for that, but I think when they reference the archetype of the predatory woman, this was considered to be this historic, from the Greek mythology stuff. I mean, she was the epitome of an evil woman, and she would basically, she perpetrated a lot of evil things on men, and it was a very predatory nature to her behavior. And so I think they referenced that as this archetype because she is almost like a model that we look at, that we see, that represents women who behave in predatory kinds of ways. And again, I'm not even sure if there's a contemporary example that I can give you where we see that archetype, but from the literature standpoint, that's how she's been viewed historically, I think. I hope I answered that question, Stephanie.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yes. Does anyone else have any questions? You can put, oh, see, Tim messaged us in the chat here. He says, I was interested in the steps presented. When someone is brought to the violence, can the process be undone?
We know that, again, when we talk about violentization, I think we do bring people back from that place and can bring people back from that place. There is a lot of pressures and demands, though, that sometimes keep them in that place. So the variables are going to be quite diverse. So, for example, we may have somebody who, if we look at the violentization process that takes place for somebody that may become a gang member, there are people who get out of the life and don't end up getting out of the life at the cemetery. They get out of the life because they make some choices and they find people who are willing to connect with them and to nurture them and to bring them forward away from that life. And so we see those kinds of things happening a great deal. We see this with, there's a great deal of violentization that takes place with victims. And so, for example, a very contemporary example where you might see some people indoctrinated into this violentization process would be people that are involved in human trafficking, that are the victims of human trafficking. And again, we see many of those folks coming out of that and beginning to do some things to begin to learn to trust again. It takes sometimes a long time for that to happen. But yes, I believe that the process can be undone. But again, it may not always be an easy journey, if that helps you, Tim.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? You can unmute yourself or put them in the chat. All right. If not, then. All right. Well, and thank you so much, Dr. Humphries, for your time. And thank you, Haley, also for helping with the program. And thank you to our attendees for joining us tonight. Again, you can visit massillonmuseum.org/Big Read to learn more about the remaining Big Read programs, and you can also view recordings of other programs that have already taken place, including Madeline Miller's keynote. That presentation will remain available on the museum's Facebook and YouTube pages through May 5th, and then it will come down. So if you haven't seen it yet, be sure you watch it. And then we hope that we'll see you virtually or in person at the museum soon. Again, NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. And thank you so much. Hope you have a great evening.